Hello, everybody. This is Brewing History. I'm your host, Pierre Bussière, and we are joined today, we don't know what time it is yet, by Malcolm Purinton. He is a professor of history, but not any kind of history. He's a professor of beer history at the Northeastern University in Boston. For the past 20 years, he's been traveling the world teaching folks about history and beer. I don't think I can think of a better job to do. But also, I don't think you will be surprised to know that at that time, he's been brewing his own beer in his own kitchen for the past 20 years. Am I right?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I've been loving it. Doing all the different styles and just, yeah, having a fun time.
Having a fun time for the past 20 years, you have got to have like your one top recipe that you want to recommend to people who listen.
Yeah, actually, my hip hop rye, I made it to be a summer beer and then I fell in love with it. So every time I brew, I'll usually like make that. I use Kolsch yeast, but I add in like a bit of honey, rose hips, hops, and it ends up being around like 7.5 to 8%. So not quite a summer beer, but it is so refreshing, just beautiful orange color and a
Nice.
nice like lacy white head.
Nice. Very nice. What's the closest sort of beer that resembles?
Gosh, I would say, yeah, it really kind of it's its own thing. I would say it's kind of like a blend of maybe a saison and a pale ale, but on the higher
Nice.
end, kind of like an imperial pale ale. I would go.
Count me in. And what are you drinking tonight?
I'm going with a favorite brewery of mine from Vermont called Zero Gravity. Going with
Hmm.
their Black Cat Porter.
Nice. I'm also thinking about going porter very soon, because well, obviously porter is a beer that highly matters for what we're talking about in this very podcast, the English industrial revolution, the revolution that changed beer forever, but it also changed the world forever. So how about we jump right in? Can you tell us what is the industrial revolution? Why did it happen? Big question.
Oh, one that is still in constant debate today.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, I mean, Industrial Revolution, like we kind of point to kind of the early to mid 18th century in England is kind of the origin where we start seeing, well, the mechanization of work on a large scale that just goes and goes. It's really England is kind of the origin location, and also it's the first real industrializing nation for pretty much going into the early 19th century. So you see the use of coal not just heating homes, but to heat steam for steam engines, which initially the very first one is just to use as a pump to pump out water from coal
Right.
mines, and then begins to be used for the textile industry and well, really every industry, including beer.
And I believe that brewers are one of the first adopters of the steam engine, right?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, it was revolutionary on God so many different levels because you also had a huge population boom. When you have like more better mechanized agriculture, they're now able to produce a whole lot more food, which
Hmm.
leads to a lot more of a population, and a lot of people moving from rural areas to the cities like London, Liverpool, and so on. And so you have a huge population in these centers where going from kind of a home brew like country ale production to now you have brewers that are able to produce beer, including porter, on a scale that had never before been seen. It's porter is really the first industrial beer ever created.
But what exactly is a porter? And the reason I ask is I know that's an important beer at a time. I believe it's one of the first beers to be truly standardized, right? For the first time, we seem to be able, in a really large scale, to be able to do that one beer and repeat it over again. Um, so, what exactly is it, and why is it that type that is drunk at that time or being exported and not other types of ales?
Oh yeah, no, porter's very specific.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, it came out of there's lots of different myths that have been now debunked. Like one was about like Ralph Harwood at his brewery in 1722.
Hmm. Hmm.
He was like I brewing like an entire, like basically a three threads beer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You'd have different tap for each different, like type, like small beer, strong beer, and so on. And he put them together as the three threads that became known as the porter. And that's all basically totally made up by
Eh,
a journalist in the early 19th century.
But the theory of the three thread, though, it does amount to something, right? There used to be different threads. Can you just explain what is exactly a thread and how it was used at the time?
Yeah, it was actually kind of more of like a taxation trick by the brewers trying to
Aha.
avoid like the strong beer taxation. So what you would do is like, I mean, when you're first brewing the beer, you have like the very first mash, you have like the most fermentable sugar coming from the grain.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they would do is then like, that would be the strong beer. We don't have thermometers or, sacchrometers or things of, the technology to kind of like really dial in how much malt and things that are being used. So you have the strong beer, but then, you're going to be using the same grain for a couple other mashes in order to like really try and get as much of the fermentable sugars out of that grain as possible, ending up with a small beer that would be, very low alcohol content, which would of course be taxed much less than the
Right.
strong beer. So you have different threads, meaning like, beers made from different levels of mash with the fermentable sugars. So if you're tying them all together, what they would do is they'd have several different casks and they would blend like the strong beer into like the small beer. So it was like not quite one or the other, but you try to like work their way around, like avoiding the full taxation of a strong beer. So it was also like how they would do it is like before porter was called a porter, it was called like an entire butt beer. So a butt being like a very like it's basically like 3 barrels worth of beer, just a very, very large cask.
All right.
And it's entire, so like with an I as well, with like the old English spelling. And so that was kind of the ability of like what the porter kind of becomes is brewers now utilizing, not just like different levels of types of hops, but also grain. And once
Mm-hmm.
they start changing some of the laws of taxation, the grain, as it gets more expensive, like paler malts, much more expensive. But because, once you have steam technology, you're able to dry that malt much better using like warm air instead of say fire. So the
Mm-hmm.
cheapest malt would be those that would be dried through fire and would also be much browner and
Yep.
darker and also bitter because I mean it's basically smoked malt.
It would give you a bit of a different taste too, right? One that would be much less appealing. I remember because I've read your thesis, and you do mention that it gives a sort of smoky or a bit of a smoky taste, but mostly it gives the beer a sort of tang.
Yeah, yeah, that would be partly because of also the different types of yeast that are around. I mean,
Hmm.
we're we're like over half a century away from Louis Pasteur's L'étude sur bière.
So
So
right, so these yeast, they're pretty much wild, aren't they? Or at least they're the yeast from the last batch mixed with just about anything else that's present in the air.
yes, exactly.
That makes me wonder, what did the inside of these massive vats that they had to age the beer, what did it look like when you just emptied the beer? Was it colonized with bacteria? Because it doesn't seem to me that they were cleaning them.
I no, I mean we don't even have germ theory. Like we're over 150 years from germ theory.
Wow.
Like we don't even really understand what's going on. So yeah, I mean like it's but how they counteracted that was
Mm-hmm.
through an aging process. This is something that was also key to the porter was that people liked what was called stale beer. So not stale as in like old and like off. It was basically they would age the beer out for like months and months at a time in
Mm-hmm.
order to let the smoky flavor dissipate. And then also like within these large wooden casks, you would have Brettanomyces coming out of the wood and eating as well. So
Mm-hmm.
as you aged it out, then that kind of secondary fermentation would dissipate as well. So by the end, you would end up with a pretty like nice, more balanced, strong, dark beer. Like
Mm-hmm.
the grain is going to be dark, so the beer is going to be dark. And with that long period, like after a while, they stop using casks and they start using, well, vats. So they
Mm-hmm.
start building underneath the breweries like vast storage spaces for vats to like leave these beers into so they could create that nice stale flavor that the consumers are really looking for.
So stale is good. At that
I just
time,
yeah, yeah.
at that time in history, if you're in England and you're drinking porter, stale is not your enemy. Stale is good for you.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. They wanted that very specific flavor that had been well aged, so all the other off flavors were kind of taken out.
But that makes me wonder. At that time in history, we're what at the beginning of the 18th century, early 19th century.
Yeah, late 18th, early 19th.
So I'm wondering, are people drinking porter because it's there and it's what everyone's selling because of taxation? Or are they drinking a beer because it really is considered better than all the other beers on the offer?
Well, or also with porter, we have to look at the specific location too. We're talking about like the London.
Right.
So like in the country, like we still have a separation between what beer is and what ale is. Ale being
Hmm.
unhopped, beer being hopped. And hopped, that hopping, coming from migrations from the Low Countries, like Belgium, Netherlands area. And so you have, hops being introduced, being used in a way that you wouldn't see outside, in the country ale sections. So if we're looking specifically at London, this is where we have, with the development of new technology. So thermometers, being
Hmm.
able to like, instead of just waiting for the steam to clear at the top of the boiling vessel, you can just actually know what temperature it is, or like the blood test, like, all right, how does this feel against my finger? And so with a temperature like thermometer, you're able to do that. And a saccharometer, you're able to like figure out, how much fermentable sugar is actually in there. And so all these different steps end up leaving the porter becoming the most stable and most consistent of
Hmm.
beer produced in London, which is the largest metropolitan area, closest to trade. You're not seeing this being produced in Burton upon Trent, for instance, where you find Bass, Allsop, salt brewers who are exporting brown ales, sparkling brown ales,
Hmm.
to the Baltic Sea and so forth. So in London, you have this huge, like new, like working, like class, this working population coming in, and you're also seeing people promote like beer is seen as definitely safer.
Hmm.
I mean, people had the availability of paler ales, of lighter brown ales. I mean, it was kind of like a London brown is what the porter becomes. Like it becomes named porter later on. Everyone already
Hmm.
knew about the like just the London style browns. But with the softer water there, and well, you're able to get economies of scale by the end of the 18th century. And
Right.
so that beer is able to be much cheaper and much a lot more affordable towards all the different classes that are developing out of kind of a rise in capital, like capitalism and industry.
So there are massive changes that are happening at that moment in London. You have the Industrial Revolution, which is facilitating the kind of thing you've never seen basically in the history of beer. So, quite extensive quality control over beer, aging for months, for a long time. And there's one other thing I'm thinking about, exportation on a truly epic scale. Can you tell us a bit more about what role that's going to play in, well, the history of brewing in general, but also for England? Does that really change, let's say, the trade balance? How important is exporting porter to England at that time?
It's one of the variety of beers being sent to the colonies.
Right.
Uh, because, like, I mean, honestly, if you look at the American colonies, for instance, they during the turn, like the time of the American Revolution, so like 1770s and so on,
Hmm.
where you see the revolutionaries calling for people to be drinking beer because rum was being produced for a British audience, and so to make it more American, they were saying drink beer because it's being produced here.
Oh.
So beer, like the for the rest of the colonies, like it's pretty essential because you don't have, especially the warmer colonies, say British Honduras, South Africa, Australia, India, you're not going to have colonial breweries being set up for until really like the middle of the 19th century. So the porter is going to be part of that. The porter is like still huge through the mid 19th century, but it's one of multiple different beers being sent out. So the
Hmm.
trade is essential, but it's people are the tastes are changing farther away from London, where you're seeing pale ales becoming got Hodgson's ale, which kind of becomes what people know of as kind of the proto-India pale ale, and other types of just brown ales and things like that. So like the porters, while it's representative of kind of like the London big brewers of industry, it is being shipped across the globe. But you're finding like the lasting kind of like the strength. People are preferring something that's a bit hoppier, a bit lighter in color, lighter in body, like mouthfeel, for those warmer climates for the different colonists.
And I bet that's going to pave the way for the ascent of Pilsner, right? Later in the at the end of the 19th century, but that's not quite happening yet. We're, let's say, early in the 19th century, porter is still king at the very least,
Oh yeah.
in London, right? It rules the place, and it seems that the brewers who are producing that beer are making so much money because they're developing these economies of scales. And one thing that they're doing that's quite fascinating is, they started doing these partnerships, right, with the bars. They start telling them, hey, we're going to give you some money. We're going to buy you out if you're in trouble. We're going to fund you. You have something to repair. We'll fix that for you. But just one thing, sell only our beer. So what does that do for the other brewers who are not the big guys? How does that play out?
Well, it plays out that you have many fewer breweries producing a lot more beer for, well, what becomes the country, like by the end of the, like by the middle of the 19th century. So what we're talking about is the tied house system,
Right.
where, so it's not even just like a partnership. A lot of times it becomes kind of a domestic battle in England for the different breweries to buy as many pubs as possible to ensure their market share. So like
Right.
they're not looking at the marketing, they're not looking at uh well, they're not really looking at like who is consuming. They're trying to figure out like how much actual land can we own where only like people can only drink our beer. So this is an ongoing, like, I mean, because once you get over like Island of Guinness, like they start kind of coming in like the latter half of the 19th century, they're not doing that. They're not looking at a tied house system. Like within
Mhm.
England, it really kind of hampers the export trade in many ways because they're so focused on that tied house system of, all right, we know how much we need to produce because we control and a lot of times just outright own all of these licensed pubs across the countryside. I mean, not just all around London, the metropolitan area, but I mean, Liverpool, Boulogne-Pontchartrain, like throughout, Manchester. So like it's the huge competition isn't with like
Mhm.
colonies, with continental Europe. It's between the major brewing firms. It starts off as small family businesses. As they increase more and more money, they start being really, yeah. By the turn of the 19th century, they are making wild amounts of money on the level of bankers and other like people. They're becoming politicians or being seen as like these power brokers because of that wealth, through that economy of scale with the help of the Industrial Revolution, all of that happening. So it's such a wonderfully unique story, really, of kind of like the British brewing industry and its, well, I guess kind of rise and fall on a global scale because they are able to ship, they are able to like dominate the colonial markets because there are no local breweries that can produce and that have beer for like a longer shelf life. So porter does become, I mean, it's representative of this broader
Mhm.
expanse. I mean, beer, just beer, not porter specifically, is the national drink of England.
Mhm.
And so they're exporting that and they have kind of a hubris because of how powerful and how
Mhm.
innovative they are at the turn of the 19th century, going through the middle of the 19th century.
I remember from your thesis that there's a nice quote out there from, a couple of officials, I believe, who are doing this report on the state of British beer in the world. And I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something to the effect of there will never be any real challenger to our position and the beer export markets. And this is how you start your thesis. You're like, they could not be more wrong. If only they paid more attention. And this is sort of what I wanted to ask you. It is a fantastic story in a way because there's this explosion of activity, really this industrious form of brewing this set of innovations that creates something really new and also much more affordable. But at the same time, eventually it ends. Especially, well, the porter um, appetite, the appetite for porter, that eventually disappears. I believe the heyday of the porter manufacturing or brewing is somewhere around 1820, and then it seems to be going downhill from there. What happens?
Tastes change.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, because the porter, I mean, it was wildly popular for a few generations. I mean, maybe two. Also, we haven't even talked about where the name comes from. So the name of the porter, I mean, it's an oft-repeated story, but like
Mm-hmm.
it's named after that working class of men, working class men who were porters, whether they were ship porters or street porters in London, basically working as well, just as animals, just carrying everything from the ships to the like all across the city on their backs, which they were drinking mostly just for the calories alone, drinking porter like I mean, upwards of 6, 8, 10 pints a day to keep themselves going, like keep it.
Wow.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, but I
yeah.
have to ask you, and I know that you've been asked that question many, many times, but I'm I'm sorry, I gotta ask you. How are they not drunk all day long? How are they not constantly hammered if they drink that much booze?
They are working their butts off.
Right.
They are sweating. They are, I mean, it is part of like it's more about calories, it's more about the meal, more about like, the partial hydration. Like they are working
Sure.
so hard. Like basically, I mean, if you look at just their metabolisms are just rapid firing. So their
Mm-hmm.
processing is pretty quickly. The beer itself is going to be, it's not going to be super strong. Maybe rather strong, but they were probably like, yeah, definitely rather buzzed through the whole day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it was definitely like, I mean, the popularity with them for this specific style, which they found, better than the autumnal ales that were much stronger made in the fall,
Right.
or like the lighter pale ales are starting to come in, but were generally like outside of their kind of like economic reach. So
Mm-hmm.
they were probably rather buzzed, but they were working so hard
Right.
that they probably, I mean, they certainly didn't have enough time to even notice. Let's just pick up something other heavy and just keep
Yeah.
moving on.
Yeah.
So
Just
the decline, yeah,
so eventually there's so much that is happening right now. I'm picturing these guys right now, rather buzzed, working their butt off. I don't know the proper English expression for that, but really having a hard time most of the time, and definitely sometimes when possible, enjoying the extra pint that gets you going, that makes that misery of a life somehow brighter. Because this is a place and time where there are no big contracts, no organized syndicates or unions yet that can really defend you. The life of the worker isn't really great.
no, no, it is very well. Life is, was it hard, short, like shortish, hard, and brutal.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, it's not an easy life. I mean, this is kind of what that sharing of identity of like the working class develops the identity of a working class over
Hmm.
the course of the early 19th century. It leads to, well, revolutions, fights, riots, and then organization of the working class. Um, but we don't need to get into Marx and Engels right now.
Not yet.
So, but the porter, so it's, I mean, it's key for that generation too, like the
Hmm.
industrial generation, the classes. I mean, like the upper classes drinking mostly like stuff coming from Burton upon Trent, from Bass, like that lighter, sparkling, as you get the Trent navigation of the canals worked out, when you have trains moving and you can get some of these beers, like the
Hmm.
wealthy classes drinking a different level of beer. And as people who enjoyed porter so much, they kind of start fading away. Like it's like in favor of, you start seeing people drinking mild and like pale ales become super
Right.
popular. You also see what people are drinking out of change from opaque type of, whether it's leather or pewter or, stone or bone. Now people are able to, through the Industrial Revolution, can afford glassware. And they're finding just how the beer looks is different. And they're
Right.
like, okay, like, this is something is, it's lighter, it's sparkly, it's, also generally like the pale ales were rather strong. So using all pale malts, getting a whole lot more sugar from those grains.
Hmm.
And you kind of see it, and people were worried about adulteration of beer. A lot of different laws and a lot of different scandals over adulterating beer. Most of it just made up by the temperance organizations, but
Are you saying this is all lies?
it was not all of them, but a lot of it was.
Right.
Yeah, so the pale ales really kind of come through when you see glassware becoming just more accessible. Just the aesthetic appeal of a lighter colored beer becomes a thing. And you see the mild ales coming through, the pale ales, the India pale ales. Like, I mean, that term doesn't really come about to the 1830s. So you're seeing like this kind of a change, not only of what people are drinking, but also like why they're drinking it. The different classes are changing. Those
Hmm.
huge porter brewers are now putting their money more towards, I mean, they're not even using all dark malts anymore. They're going to use, the higher quality pale malts with a
Right.
small amount of dark malt to make it the same color. And the people want to have a fresh beer instead of one that has been aged over time. So
Hmm.
there's a lot going on with like the consumers' preferences at the time.
I'm thinking also the evolution of not necessarily rights or lifestyles, but maybe the better way to explain this is the betterment of overall conditions as wealth accumulates overall. Some more people are lifted out of poverty and are able to afford, well, more of the good stuff, including the pale ales. And then there's this other change that happens at the same time, the ascent of the Pilsner. There's this one anecdote that I remember reading not too long ago about what it felt like to look at the pills when it was invented, like in the first decade, when it started to be served not in any mug, not in any tankard, but in glassware. In Bohemia, there were a lot of people that had never seen the color of their beer, at least from the side. And now all of a sudden we start selling these pure, like golden beers, and it's heralded as so many good things, so much of the good stuff. It becomes a status. You deserve a refreshing drink. You deserve the best of the best. It's associated with the higher purity level, right? Because it's transparent. And some of that is publicity, of course, but I bet that's got to have some negative impact on the reign of the porter beer.
It's really the reign of the British beer overall.
Oh, right.
It's it's not just the porter. I mean, the porter at the moment of like kind of the ascendance of Pilsner out of Central Europe, like the porter is already on a decline in the
Right.
favor of the lighter pale ales and miles that are coming through. And so the Pilsners, I mean, going all the way up to like the 1890s or so, you don't see British brewers seeing the Pilsner or just lagers in general as any type of threat to their dominance. I mean, they're
Hmm.
kind of willfully ignorant, honestly. I mean, God, South Africa in Cape Town, there was a British brewer in the 1860s that attempts a lager brewery and fails because at that point, I mean, British colony at that point, like no one's ready for it. No one wants
Hmm.
it. Nobody cares. And so like 20 years later, like there's a huge change, and he's like, yeah, I mean, I was just ahead of my time. I should have been like totally winning on this front, but you know, just a bit too early in a British colonial market of lots of different immigrants in Cape Town, but like he was not on the right path at the right time.
Right. Did that happen to many other breweries? Um, did that happen in many other colonies? Now there are other types of beers that seem to be much easier to produce. In fact, if you have enough capital, and so many other places.
Yeah, I mean, you also so I'm kind of going back to what I said earlier about
Hmm.
just the climate of most of the colonies. Much warmer. So I mean, in Europe, like Northern Europe, you were seeing, people were, I mean, there were laws against brewing really between kind of April to October because you couldn't control the fermentation or anything like in the summertime. So the beers would often go bad, spoil, just be unhealthy. And so actually, I'm currently working on an article about mechanized refrigeration that'll should be published in about a year, through the brewing industries, because the rise of, well, any type of temperature control. First, you need a thermometer to
Right.
understand what the temperatures are, but then
Right.
you have to understand temperature control, and then how you're able to then control not just like the boiling and like how to cool off the wort as quickly as possible, but also like how long to ferment it at what specific temperature.
Hmm.
uh, I mean, we're looking at this kind of like the not scientific revolution, the kind of pure yeast revolution, going from like the 1870s onwards, where you were combining all of these different technologies to produce, well, choice being Pilsner, to produce like the most consistent beer possible. Because consistency throughout time of brewing is always a very hard thing to hit.
Right.
It is. That's why now everything's just, I mean, dialed in so tightly, for brewing any type of beer now. And that's really kind of develops out of the Industrial Revolution. Porter being like the style that really helps push both with like the capital that's produced, to be able to innovate and like expand and try different techniques, through the through late 18th, early 19th century, like with the sacchrometer, adding all these
Hmm.
pieces in. They start using copper coils, like they said, a temperature, like kind of thing, like to try to cool down the beer more quickly, instead of kind of what they would do, they brew the beer down on the floor and then raise it to the top of the brewery where they have kind of
Right.
area, working on like using gravity from that point on,
Yeah.
to move the beer through the process. But then once you're able to use, say, copper coils, I mean, you have to have the ability to make copper coils that you could run water through
Right.
first. So all these things come together in producing these beers and then going onwards, like to produce all the different beers. Because now, I mean, it's not just the porter that's being made better and more consistently. It's the pale ales. It's the autumnal
Right.
ale. It is the milds. It is like you can make a lower alcohol beer that is an excellent quality and is not just kind of the runoff of the mash.
It branches out. The know-how starts proliferating, and that then leads to more accessible, better, and cleaner beers all around. So the porter doesn't exactly die then. It becomes, let's say, the beginning for all sorts of new types of beers who then can use the knowledge. And I wonder, this is my last question, I promise. um, where is the porter now in the global beerscape? We know about one type of beer that has evolved out of the porter, the stout, and stout kind of seems like it has a legitimately good name for itself. It seems to be one of the big staples for the breweries who want to have one of their own styles. It seems to be really back on track, but that's a mutation of the original recipe, right? What about the porter? Is it still a thing?
Yeah, but very not. It's really declined just the past few years.
Yeah.
It was actually kind of hard for me to find a porter today, and yeah, it had a resurgence in the like basically like late 80s and through the 1990s with craft beer.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, you always have, so like the stout was initially just like the strong version of a porter.
Right.
Uh, and then, with Guinness, I mean, like if you look at all like the trade records across the colonies, late 19th century, like Guinness was not, I mean, I hung out at the archives there, by the way, it's pretty cool. And they did
You
not
know, I'm
market
jealous right now, right? You are aware of my jealousy.
the archives I went to, and it was amazing. Yeah, doing the
Nice.
research for my dissertation, and like now again for the manuscript, it has just been one of the best parts about the whole process.
I
But yeah,
bet.
like it was not even marketing itself as Guinness until the 20th century.
Wow.
Like they were producing all of the beer. So you knew if you look at an advertisement in, well, say Cape Town or in Sydney, Australia or something, that, if there was an Irish stout coming in, you knew it was going to be produced at St. James Gate, but it
Hmm.
would be under the name of whatever bottler that they were, selling to. So they produce all the beer, then they put all of the distribution in the hands of different bottlers. And so that kind of gains its own traction and style. Like that whole story of just kind of like they hired these beer journalists. Well, these beer travelers. Arthur Shand is one of the most famous late 19th century to travel to every single market where Guinness was being sold to taste the Guinness in all of these places, like across the entire world. His notes and his journals are just amazing. So I mean, he's just looking. I mean, whether it was on a cruise ship or in a pub in a city or a small town, even he was testing the Guinness to make sure the bottlers were holding up their end.
So I have so many questions. Is he like a freelance journalist who's, up to get these guys from Guinness who try and be better than everyone? Or is he like, I don't know, a contractor who's working for Guinness for quality control? And also, I'm sorry, but I have to ask you this again and again. How was he not hammered the whole time?
I mean, honestly, that's part of kind of being a beer writer, journalist, because I write for a regional beer magazine as the Boston columnist, Yankee Brew News.
Hmm.
And a part of the process of kind of going to lots and lots of events and tasting lots and lots of beer is really learning, how much to taste and
Right.
what the goal of the situation is. The
Hmm.
goal is not to get drunk. The goal
Absolutely.
is to
Yeah.
taste and converse and learn more about the stories that are involved in different types of beers. So
Hmm.
Arthur Shand, he was not drinking Guinness day in day out. He was
Hmm.
sipping Guinness day in day out. During all of his different travels and keeping meticulous notes
Hmm.
on the different tastes, on different flavors, on the carbonation, on the consistency, all the way through. So he was, I mean, yes, drinking a lot, and he was hired by Guinness. Like he was one of two or three of these beer travelers, late 19th, early 20th century, traveling around to make sure that their product was consistent throughout. And then they take on doing their own distribution marketing in the 19 teens. That's where you start seeing teens and 20s. You see the development of Guinness for health and all these things.
Right.
So stouts, I think, have really come back. Looking at craft beer right now,
Hmm.
if we look at the porter, came back quite a bit through the 1990s and even like early 2000s, but it was still the moment of craft beer, like American craft beer, where it was about mimicking the European styles, like producing ales that hadn't been around in the United States, on a broad scale by anyone. So it's about reintroducing styles from
Hmm.
the old country, if you will. And so it had a heyday, and you also had, imperial stouts coming in. You still see more Baltic porters now than just porters, uh,
Hmm.
lagering and stuff. So they're looking for more robust, all these types of things. But the stout has come through. I'm not entirely sure. Like, if I was going to hypothesize, I would say it's because of the ongoing popularity of Guinness. So the stout is still something that could be tied
Right.
to a brand that has been produced with a long history, long story and narrative. So you see the stout going in, and then also it's sweeter than a porter. So you can see that part. People are making, milk stouts and the barrel aging with the stouts, adding all of the sweetness and the lactose and stuff to the stout instead of a porter. And I think possibly because of the popularity throughout the past several hundred years of Guinness. So maybe just like that recognition of the
Hmm.
style of that name as craft beer has changed considerably to being one of innovative flavors and focusing on narratives of authenticity and so forth instead of just reintroducing new style, like returning styles to the public.
Right. And I do remember seeing that Guinness is maybe in the top 30 in terms of either exports or production worldwide. I mean, they have a fantastic success. But if we go back to the English Industrial Revolution, it's always complicated for me to say that because I think in French and we have the order completely upside down. It's always the opposite. So that's why it takes me forever to say that. Still, What I think that I take away from this podcast, from our conversation, is the porter is both the father and the child, if you want, of the uh, revolution that took place, that changed, well, industrial processes, that changed consumption, that gave rise, even in some parts, to individualism, that gives us the proletariat, right? And then at the same time, even though the porter sorts of starts fading away halfway through the 19th century, the technology that made it possible um, then also makes it possible for other beers to emerge, and beers that are quite palatable. Also has some, influence in changing the lifestyles of peoples. It also gives us a great topic for another podcast. But in all seriousness, thanks very much for having been with us for this podcast. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, thank you very, very much. I've had such a great time.
All right. Hopefully, we'll do that again. For those that are listening to us, don't hesitate to press the subscribe button if you like this podcast. Cheers, and see you in a bit.